we welcome you to the Art of Rome. This is called An Introduction to the Art of Rome. And we want to be familiar with some of the general information and knowledge about this great civilization that has affected all of us, the Roman civilization. We've studied ancient Egypt and we've studied Greece. Now we come to the civilization that lasted almost 1,000 years in its focus, some of it religious empire and the other a military empire. But what a civilization it was that has given the world so much in terms of its inventions, in terms of architecture, in terms of sculpture, in terms of law. So we come now to the introduction to art, the art of Rome. And even in this cover, we see Roman sculpture that has such a profound impact in detail. We see a piece of sculpture created during the classical period called the Dying Gaul. And we have the Trevi Fountain down, an outdoor fountain with sculpture that's integrated into the architecture. And to hear that water flowing, what an exciting place to be. The Romans mastered relief sculpture. The Romans mastered building. Now, when we look at Michelangelo's ceiling in the Sistine Chapel, that was the 15th century. That was during the Renaissance, but that was part of Roman art because Michelangelo did that when he was in his 30s. And then a person could be known and really known for their wealth or whether they were a peasant or slave, but the wealthy people could afford to come up with fancy hairdos, very detailed hand hairdos, which would make them stand out and be known as someone who could afford that. The Romans were great with high relief, and we shall learn as we go through this introduction that these inventions, particularly that of the arch, was that revolutionary invention that created so many architectural feats like the Colosseum, like the arches, like the aqueducts, like the churches that were built because they discovered the arch. So what then is Roman art? Many people can look at that whole empire period or territories, and Rome went as far east as Spain, and it went west to Persia, and we also know that was during the time when they conquered Egypt. But we talk about Roman art as the architecture and the painting and the sculpture, and particularly mosaic work of the Roman Empire, the Roman civilization. And down on the bottom left is that piece of architecture that is in full tact today. It was built 100 AD, and yet today, this morning, the doors of that building opened and people went in to see this marvelous structure that still stands after 2,000 years, the Pantheon. So the Romans gave us a multiplicity of things. One, the arch, allowing openings in walls coming from a keystone, which we will look at in a moment. The dome, the Romans gave us the invention of the dome, which could reflect water, but also had a dramatic aesthetic effect to it. The rotunda, which came behind a Greek portico many times, and we have in our capital of the United States a rotunda. And also in that same building you saw the Pantheon, there was a rotunda. The Romans excelled in road building, and of course that was for military purposes, but the engineering of it so that it would last. And we're going to visit and see a road called the Appian Way in Rome, in which people went to work driving cars this morning. One of the greatest things and contributions of the Romans, however, was a simple thing we kind of take for granted, and that is cement, concrete. This really brought things together where we could have a binding source. That combined with the arch, we could come up with some buildings that were ultimately fantastic. Last but not least, because of the arch, the Romans were able to create something we call an aqueduct with several arches, but it would bring and sort of be like a bridge to bring fresh water into the city. And Rome, even at 100 AD, some 2,000 years ago, had running water throughout the city. Now, when did Rome come about and how? What is the myth behind it? There's a legend that has it that Rome was founded by twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, and that they were raised by a god by the name of Mars, and she was a she-wolf, and she raised these two. Later on, Remus killed Romulus. Romulus killed Remus, and we have the beginning of the city we call Rome. Now, of course, that's myth, but there's been much sculpture and all kinds of renditions in the art world of Romulus and Remus. We see the Trevi Fountain, but down below we see St. Peter's Square. When the dome was created there, that was Michelangelo in the 15th century during the Renaissance. And Rome is such a fascinating city, but we need to understand that in the upper left here we see the Roman Forum. That was where everything took place. We had the Baths of Caracalla, we had the Senate, we had all kinds of public facilities that constituted something we call the Roman Forum. We had the castle, we had the Roman sofa, which you sit on in the side, you raise your legs up a little differently than we have sofas today where our feet touch the ground. The Romans were always portrayed as important citizens, and with that eclectic spirit, meaning taking what was best from the Greeks and everyone else, and they had that Herculean look to it. The Roman emperors loved what we call sculpture gardens. And Hadrian, here we have down in the bottom left, Hadrian's sculpture garden, the emperor who liked to walk around a pool and see sculpture all around him. And then today, we have many contemporary artists. This is a contemporary artist in Rome, but notice how that color red is mastered, and I'm going to come back to that and why they use red. But we're looking at the Roman Forum, and in the Roman Forum was a building we call the Colosseum. And the Colosseum could house 50,000 people in the arena, and it had a covering to it in which they used to pull and keep the weather out. And of course, with the body heat, that created warmth in the building in the middle of the winter. In the upper right, we see St. Peter's Square. So the Roman Forum, in its day, had baths, it had shopping malls, it had marketplaces, it had courthouses, and of course, they put emphasis on officials. Their sculpture did not fall like the Greeks did in the gods and goddesses, but they would sort of elevate citizens, famous citizens of Rome, either with relief sculpture or with three-dimensional marble sculpture. Their sculpture tended to move. unlike that of the Egyptian, which was very stiff. And of course, the Roman soldier could be recognized anywhere. The Romans didn't embrace the Greek style of putting columns together in sections. They would rather the more expensive buildings bring and ship them in from Egypt, solid limestone. And of course, like Athens, the Romans had these arenas that imitated and were part of the Athenian athletic ideal, which was this. In other words, the Olympics came out of the Greeks and then went into Rome. But the most significant of the inventions was that of the arch, a little simple thing we take for granted. And it had in its center a keystone. That keystone distributed the weight on either side so as to, when we had an arch, and then we duplicated that arch and duplicated that arch, we came up with what is called a vault, or as they used to call it, a tunnel vault, or a barrel vault. Now, when we look at the architecture of the Pantheon, not the Parthenon, but the Pantheon, we see our Greek portico, which the Romans adopted, and the Romans were very eclectic. What do you mean eclectic? Eclectic is when you bring and you take the best of what is there. So Rome conquered Greece, and Rome conquered Egypt, and Rome conquered Persia, and they took the best and they made it into an eclectic society. So here we see the Greek portico, but the Romans, in their engineering genius, came up with the rotunda. And you can almost see a circle that you could put into the Pantheon, and it had an opening at the top we call the oculus. So here we have the Greek portico, this Pantheon in Rome, and this dome were layers of circles that became smaller and smaller. But at the top here, we had what is called an oculus, and water used to flow down. And yet, when I show you this floor, there's a marble floor. It looks like it was new. There's no discoloration. It's just a fabulous building. And just think, that was created in 100 AD, and it stays intact today and was used this morning. This giant building with limestone columns shipped from Egypt. Hadrian wanted the very best. And the columns in Rome tend to focus in on Corinthian columns. They like the Corinthian design with the acanthus flower. And then behind it, you had the rotunda. And that rotunda was this giant opening. And this is the Pantheon. Many times they love to use an obelisk because it kind of symbolized the conquering of Egypt. But this is the way the Pantheon looks today, this day, as we look at how Hadrian created this fantastic building. For many years, it had the largest dome in the world. These are what we call coffers. And at the top, we have the oculus. So it would rain in here for the last 2,000 years, it is said. And of course, Pantheon means many gods. So this temple, they still don't know exactly what it was used for, but this temple is called the Pantheon, for many gods. And Rome, like Greece, was a polytheistic worshiping group. There were many gods, and the Romans adopted the Greek gods, but they changed their names, and we'll look at a chart. So these Pantheon columns were just fantastic. And the doors and the hinges that you see there on that door that opened this morning are the same hinges that were there 100 AD. Look at that floor. Look at how the squares in the floor, that's marble. and they haven't been discolorated one bit after 2,000 years of rain coming down through the oculus. You see the floor there. This is the Pantheon. It had the largest dome span for many years until around the 15th century. So let's look at this in a very objective way as we compare Greek or Roman. The preferred structure with the Greeks, they wanted to build temples to glorify their gods. Athena, and of course we have the Parthenon. But the Romans wanted to build buildings to honor their empire, their civic buildings, their government buildings. When you look at the walls that the Greeks used, were cut from stone blocks. But the Romans, because they invented concrete, it had an ornamental face, and they could do all kinds of things with the concrete. The Greeks loved to use geometric forms, just as the Romans, but the Greeks used more rectangles and straight lines, whereas the Romans wanted curves, and they had all kinds of arches, and they used the circle. Now, the Greeks did a good job with the amphitheater, but the Romans, with the dome and with the Colosseum and all those buildings, these were curved lines. The Greeks used post and lintel, that's two uprights and a cross member. But the Romans used the arch because it could redirect the pressure that came from the heavy stones. The Greeks used Doric and Ionic and Corinthian, but the Romans really put a lot of emphasis on Corinthian. And the sculpture tended to, for the Greeks, idealize their gods. They idolized their gods and goddesses and made them perfect figures, whereas the Romans tended to put more emphasis on realism, and their subject matter happened to be more officials. Roman painting can be picked up very easy because the backgrounds tend to be red, and whereas the Greeks had more stylized floating figures in space. And last but not least, the subject of their artwork tended to be mythology. In Greece, the Greek-Roman gods and goddesses, whereas in Rome, their subject matter was focused in on civic leaders, military generals, and of course battles that had been won by the Romans. So as we go on our tour of the city of Rome, there's the church with the Spanish steps, and you ought to see when they have the flower festival. This is just a part of it. They place flowers all the way up to the church. And you see remnants in the museum of Constantine. He was the first Holy Roman Emperor around 300 AD, and he saw a vision, he said, one night, and he saw a burning cross, and that meant for him to become a Christian. And of course, his mother was a very devout religious person. She went to the Holy Land, identified and discovered many holy sites. So Constantine, who constituted the church as the main governance unit or tool, and so the Roman government ruled through archbishops and bishops and clergy rather than a military might. So there we have our Pantheon. Behind it, the rotunda. You see the Corinthian columns or the Corinthian capitals here. And this is all Roman, designed to make, as the Egyptians did, large pieces of sculpture designed to make you realize that these were large people in your mind. This is the Jefferson Memorial, but if you go back and look at the Pantheon, it has a Greek portico, and then it has a rotunda. And this is the Jefferson Memorial. It has a dome. It doesn't have an oculus, but it's very similar to the Pantheon. Now, the columns here are Ionic. You see the scrolls. And at our capital of the United States, here's that Greek portico in the center, and Greek portico. We have the House of Representatives, we have the entrance to the Capitol, and then we have the Senate side. But behind it is this great rotunda. And many people, Rosa Parks recently, Alliance State, a flag was held at half-staff, but she was a big part of the bus boycott that broke segregation in Alabama, and she became a hero to all of us, and she was one of the great Americans who wasn't president, who was not necessarily a lawmaker, but recognized for her historical role in freedom for African Americans. And she would lie in state in the rotunda of the Capitol of the United States of America. So I trust that you will see there's that portico, here's the frieze, and then we see the Corinthian columns. And this is the capital of the United States. And let's understand, as we said about Greece, if a Greek or Roman were to come to Washington, D.C., they would feel very much at home. What were we trying to do? We tried to replicate and reproduce a physical democracy. So since Greece and Rome, practiced democracy, we have chosen to place our government buildings. If you were to go to the Mint, if you would go to the Lincoln Memorial, you would see the same design as the Greeks. These solid limestone or marble columns. And of course, look how they use the vertical line. The vertical line in art is very important to give order when you repeat it. You might note that some bankers use pinstripe suits to give them a sense of order and power. So this vertical line rising up, and the Romans used that to its fullest in their architecture. Here we get a chance to see some Roman painting. And as I told you before, you can always note paintings of the ancient Romans because the backgrounds have this bright red. Renaissance painting, which later on was mostly frescoes, didn't focus with the red background. But here, the early ancient paintings that used to be in the homes of wealthy Romans, they had a red background. And as I told you before, women, their headdress, you could tell they were prominent or wealthy or prestigious people because they were the ones who could afford to get their hair done. So in Rome, as you go about, you see St. Peter's Basilica, and we are overlooking St. Peter's Square. Each of these pieces of sculpture represents one of the saints, or what the Catholic Church, they vote on the sainthood of people. Pope John Paul II was recently voted to be a saint. And so they are all here. This square was designed by a Baroque artist by the name of Bernini. And there's the famous Michelangelo designed dome. Over here we see this building, which is the Sistine Chapel. And then later on, we see as we look over the city from the top of the dome, we look down on Rome. Now, the Trevi Fountain, and I hope you all get a chance to go to the Trevi Fountain. I'll never forget when I went to Niagara Falls, and when I got out of the car, I heard this roar, which represented that sound of power and of greatness coming from Niagara Falls, falling, making this roar. So it is when you go to the Trevi Fountain that you see in the sculpture and the sound of the moving water. and how that sculpture is integrated into the architecture. And so Rome is a great place to be. Great restaurants, great places to buy leather, great places to buy material for suits and dresses and knits and fashions. And we have the Piazza Navona, which is very famous for its sculpture and moving fountains, the fountains like the Trevi Fountain. And you could sit there all day and enjoy this sculpture amidst the moving water. And when you visit the Vatican Museum, or you go to the Vatican, they take you on the side and you go through what is called the Vatican Museum. What a beautiful place to be as you walk and you see the treasures of the Vatican. One time I was here, and it was during the time when Pope Paul was living, and I looked to the right in the garden, and I saw him walking in the garden. The Vatican Museum, treasures from over the centuries, priceless. And of course, Michelangelo's dome, which we could study all day. Now, inside St. Peter's Basilica in Rome is the canopy, which marks the spot where Apostle Peter was crucified. He said, I don't want to be up and my feet below me. I want to be crucified upside down because I'm not worthy to be crucified the same way as Christ. So Peter was crucified right here on this spot. And Bernini, that same Baroque artist who designed St. Peter's Square, he designed this canopy. Now, under the floor, you can take and go down steps here. You can see part of the steps, and you can see all 240-some popes are buried beneath the floor of St. Peter's Basilica. Then on Christmas Eve, you look at the Mass from Rome that the Pope conducts on Christmas Eve, more closely like 12 o'clock, 11, 12 o'clock at midnight, and you will see this spot. He conducts it from this altar here in St. Peter's Basilica. And back behind is what we call the throne of Peter. Very ornate. That too was created by Bernini. You also see pieces of sculpture with these, or fitting in these niches. What is a niche? It's that opening, or that opening so that the sculpture comes forward, and the shadow creates a frame for the sculpture. So there's nothing like being in Rome, the Tiber River, the main river of Rome, and to sit on the top of the dome of St. Peter's and see St. Peter's Square and all these, how small the people they are. Cars are not allowed in here anymore. But this spot right here marks where we leave Italy, which is on this side, and we come into the Vatican, which is like a separate nation. When we go around St. Peter's, we see this arcade. This was given to us by the Romans. This gave us, the concrete gave us the pediment, the post here, but this arcade was all through the use of Roman architecture. And on the left, you see the Pope's residence, and every week on Wednesday and Sunday at 12 p.m., this window will open up here, and his banner will flow down, and he will give a sermon or sermonette and read from his place. This is the residence of the Pope. So inside St. Peter's Basilica, and we call the church a basilica, look at the beauty of this place. The dome that Michelangelo designed is right above the canopy that was created by Bernini. And as you come toward the back of the church, you will see on this right side here, you will see Michelangelo's Pietà, that he created when he was 25 years old. One of the most famous pieces of sculpture in all the world. And they have it bulletproof now because a person went and tried to chop it up some 25 years ago. But what a fascinating, fascinating piece of sculpture. And when you go into the Sistine Chapel and just look up, you recognize Michelangelo's panels. He did 33 panels on the Old Testament. Now remember, people could not read and write. And so to use art as a teaching vehicle, we learned earlier that art, one of the functions of art, is that it teach. And so we have all these Old Testament excerpts up here by which these pictures were used to teach. And Michelangelo spent 4.5 years in the ceiling doing 33 panels. He had lots of fights with Pope Julius, and that's a fascinating story. But he completed this large group of frescoes, and he was in his 30s at this time. Later, he was called back to do this. Now, this ceiling took him 4.5 years, but he was called back in his 60s to paint this fresco called The Last Judgment, those going up into heaven and those going into purgatory. And there was a cardinal who gave him a hard time, gave him a rough way to go. And so Michelangelo, with his spiteful self, painted a picture of the cardinal and those going into purgatory. And the Pope could not excuse it. I can't have nothing. I have no power over hell. You have to stay there, and your image has to stay there. What a great story, a true story. And then we see Michelangelo. You have to go outside of St. Peter's Basilica to a church around the corner called San Pietro. And there you will find Michelangelo's Moses. If you, and of course he did this in the classical form, look at Moses. He's supposed to have been 120 years old, but that body looks like a Herculean figure in his 30s. Look at those arms. Look at those legs. And look, if he stood up, he'd be 12 feet tall. If he smacked you in the face, you would be flat as a pancake, because that was the power of the artist to give the image, the kind of image that he wanted to reflect. And so here is Michelangelo's rendition of Moses. These horns were here because there was a misinterpretation of what Michelangelo read about him before he created this piece of sculpture. But there Moses sits in a niche, and it is said that Michelangelo took a mallet and tapped him on the knee and commanded it to speak. In other words, he was so proud of this piece called Moses. Now, the Circus Maximus, you all remember Ben-Hur, and at the end of the picture, the chariots are fighting. And of course, they could put 250,000 people into this large stadium, and where they had all the arena fights. They would build arches. This is an arch dedicated to the Emperor Titus. And you see the arch, and you see the keystone. So that Circus Maximus was able to house 250,000 people. And here we see the arch of Titus with the arch and, of course, the keystone, which tended to allow for the opening in large buildings or heavy buildings, the arch of Titus. The campaigns of generals and emperors were placed on these arches. Like the Egyptians, they believed that stone was forever. And as I told you before, the Romans are great road builders. They would put, and they would measure it very carefully. They'd put stone, and then they'd put a special kind of sand covering, and then they put another layer of stones, and then the last layer of stones. And of course, this road was traveled on today, just like the Pantheon, the doors open today. This road, and we call this the Appian Way. That's the main road, but believe it or not, cars drive up on this road, the Appian Way, into Rome. We have the Cathedral of St. Paul's, and up top, they use quite a bit of mosaic. When we look at St. Marco Basilica in Venice, you'll see a lot of mosaics, and when the sun comes out, those gold mosaics just give a radiance and a beauty that is just fascinating. We see the sculpture of Paul in the front garden, and we see paintings in the church or mosaics that have put together biblical episodes. So we have the Church of St. Paul, and of course this is supposed to represent Apostle Paul. Fantastic piece of sculpture. Last but not least is the Colosseum. This stadium held 55,000 people. It had aqueducts where for entertainment they used to bring in sharks. You had to fight the sharks. The Christians were put here. Tigers and lions would come out. Gladiators would come out. And this was the entertainment center. Now these posts up here represent that when they wanted to cover it. So in a later episode here, we see they would pull this canvas over the Colosseum so that you could see it. And of course, this is the way it looks today, still standing, the arches still holding, and this is the famous Colosseum of Rome. I invite you to go here. Outside they have Roman soldiers who are dressed up in Roman uniforms, and you can see the aqueducts, you can see the elevators, you can see where the gladiators had to fight in this great arena. And then we go back to Piazza Navona, and what a place it is. Look at this sculpture here showing that powerful physique that the Greeks personified and the Romans claimed and adopted. So in Europe, particularly in squares like this, you have your sculpture, you have your running fountains, you have artists, and then you have your outdoor restaurants and cafes. You can sit here all day and have a cup of coffee and no one will bother you. So this is European living, the Piazza Navona, and I want all of you to visit this square that is sold. Cars are not allowed here, and to enjoy sculpture. Remember, sculpture can be seen from 360 different angles. That means the sculptor is giving you 360 different pictures. In Rome, there's a shopping avenue that's very famous. It's called Via Veneto. You can buy all kinds of leather, all kinds of jewelry, all kinds of clothing. It's called Via Veneto, which is the Fifth Avenue of Rome. So in this introduction, I trust you will read a lot more in our textbooks, but this is an introduction to the art of Rome. And I invite you to travel to Rome. What a city, what a place. What to marvel at all that they contributed to the world history. And today we use concrete, we use arches, we build roads, and much of this, even our Roman law, based with a framework from the Romans. So let's not forget their great contributions. The arch, the dome, the rotunda, the road building, the concrete, and of course, aqueducts, which allowed us to bring water from one place to another. I want you to visit Rome. I want every one of you to travel to this great city.